Howdy, y'all! I'm Rissy, and I review things. Today, I'm reviewing the fourth book in the Horus Heresy series, The Flight of the Eisenstein, by James Swallow. This is the book about legionaries of the Death Guard, for which I have created a very special all-face inclusive makeup look. But to learn all about that, and of course, this book, you'll have to keep watching. And for my part, I must have a face as bare as the top of Grandfather Nurgle's head. We're gonna get into some serious nurgling today. I'm gonna nurgle for many, many minutes. We're gonna have to do this at a relatively speedy clip because boy, there's a lot to talk about in this book. Still not have found my headband, so I guess it's just gonna be me and my pretty princess tiara while I do Warhammer reviews. Alright, hair out the way. I'm gonna go ahead and sum up the plot of this book first, so that we can go ahead and talk about the meatier stuff. This book, Flight of the Eisenstein, is the last book in the series that is a must-read until you get way further down in the series, in terms of books that are required to understand exactly what is happening in the Horus Heresy. From here on out, there are a lot of books that are not filler per se, but that you don't necessarily need to read if you were trying to blaze your way through the Horus Heresy series with maximum comprehension for minimum effort. We begin the book with Nathaniel Garro. We'll get into more about his character later, I promise. He is the battle captain of the 7th Great Company of the Death Guard. Now, the Death Guard are one of those legions that clearly started off as bad guys, but at this point they are guarding against death, ostensibly, before they've fully turned traitor. This is all a flashback compared to the events of the 3rd book. We're going back in time so that we can watch Nathaniel Garro and a bunch of other Death Guard dudes, including the Death Guard's Primarch Mortarion, team up with the Silent Sisterhood of the Imperium. More on them later, but these are women who have really powerful anti-psychic abilities. They're nulls or pariahs, untouchables, whatever you want to call them, and their whole thing is that psychic powers not only don't work on them, but they have no psychic presence themselves, and in fact, their very existence suppresses psychic shit going on. And that's really important because the filthy xeno species that our characters are fighting has some gross, creepy, psychic versions of itself that are kind of like the boss fight. A lot of cool combat and murdering of gross xenos. The main point is that the Death Guard come away victorious. We've made a connection with the Sisters of Silence. Nathaniel Garro, of course, has excelled in combat, which means he needs to be honored afterwards, or at least Mortarion thinks that. At this stage in the game, Mortarion is pretty much already gone full traitor. He just hasn't exposed it yet. We're kind of in the same holding pattern as Horus from the beginning of the 3rd book. A lot of the stuff that follows is Mortarion really trying to convince Nathaniel Garro to be on his side in the upcoming rebellion, since he's already turned traitor in his heart, which is where it matters, of course. Next, we head down to good old Istvan 3. Well, okay, first we go to Istvan Extremis. I didn't really cover this part in my last review because I didn't want it to be a million hours long, although watching some other book reviews, apparently people have no problem with watching like 2 solid hours of book review content, which if that's what you want, let me know. I prefer to keep my videos down under 45 minutes if I can help it, but I guess if that's what the people want, I'm more than happy to give it to you. And my name isn't even X. Don't give it to ya! First we go to Istvan Extremis, which is a moon, I think. This is important because, first of all, it puts the Emperor's children and the Death Guard in the same place, and that's very important because we need Nathaniel Garro to hook up with his old friend. Well, okay, not although I could totally see it happening, for Nathaniel Garro to meet his old friend and battle brother, Saul Tarvitz. Also, Garro has to be out of commission. He can't be able to go to Istvan 3, and what happens in Istvan Extremis is a war singer knocks Garro off the top of a tower. One of his legs is just kind of torn off, but him being a space marine, they're like, yeah, just get him back to the ship and we'll get him a new leg. And this is very consistent over the course of the books. Limb replacement is not an issue for space marines. If you get to a certain point where like all of your limbs are missing, you're probably going into a dreadnought, but the loss of a single limb, you'll probably be just fine, and not only fine, but combat ready. It's at this point, of course, that the wounded Nathaniel Garro, who is not able to go down and fight on Istvan 3, has been put in co-command of the frigate Eisenstein. This is not a battleship, exactly. It's not, an Imperial Star Destroyer or anything along those lines, but he wants something to do while he's still recovering. and he is given the co-captainship with Ignatius Grulgor, which is a fantastic name, but who is also a huge asshole, who's totally a traitor and absolutely hates our boy. Garrow catches Grulgor loading virus bombs onto his ship, and it's like, wait, what's going on? There aren't supposed to be virus bombs. Garrow and his squad end up having to fight Grulgor's goons to the death over these fucking virus bombs, and then that is the point at which the Thunderhawk containing Carol Cinderman, Mercedes Oleton, Euphrati Keeler, and Eocton Cruz comes flying towards them, and Garrow gets a call from his old buddy Saul Tarvitz informing him of exactly what the fuck is happening, begging him to provide shelter for those fleeing the vengeful spirit. And Garrow makes a split-second decision based on his knowledge of Saul Tarvitz and also his knowledge of what just went down. And he's reviewing some things in his mind. He's like, oh yeah, maybe some shady shit has been going on. He reacts to the news, I guess, a lot better than others, as we will find out later in this book. But he also has Saul Tarvitz to lean on. That helps quite a bit. The Eisenstein takes our fleeing truth-tellers from the Vengeful Spirit aboard, and then is attacked after pretending to destroy the Thunderhawk. And pretty soon, they're being set upon by the forces of the traitors. They have to go into the warp, because of course now the goal is get back to the Imperium with all haste and inform the Emperor what the fuck is happening. This is the really crucial part of the book. This is going to be how the Empire finds out about the brewing civil war and the fact that fully half of the Primarchs have turned traitor. Unfortunately, the emergency warp translation plus the damage to the ship makes it so that the force of Nurgle is able to enter the ship, reanimates Golgor and his crew as gross, disgusting, nurgling undead. That kind of occupies everybody's time for a while, and it gets so bad that because, I mean, they're in the warp, and Nurgle is a warp entity, and these disgusting creatures are powered by the warp. So Garrow's like, fuck it, just get us out of the warp, and it might help, which it does. They just blast themselves out of the warp. It's not a very easy landing. It kills their navigator, but it does also remove the taint of Nurgle from the ship. The problem is, though, that now they are nowhere. They're just out in the middle of space, not close to the Imperium particularly, and also their warp drive is damaged, and they have to jettison it, Star Trek style, eject the warp core! However, this is actually a pretty clever plan in disguise, because the warp drive, in exploding, will act as a beacon. It's their best chance to actually be rescued by somebody. Now, of course, it's one of those like, well, a beacon could attract anything, but in this case, it attracts the attentions of Rogal Dorn, the Primarch of the Imperial Fists. He and a bunch of his legion have been trapped in space for a while. There have been warp storms, and so they haven't really been able to get back to the Imperium using the warp. The Emperor had called Rogal back so that he could assist the Emperor with his Webway project, fortifying the palace against potential threats. Rogal's job is to reinstall the palace, if you know what I'm talking about. So the Imperial Fists show up and kind of save the day, except they really have to be convinced of what's going on. Rogal Dorn refuses to believe what is happening, and of course he and Horus were close, so that makes sense. Finally, it is Mercedes Oleton, our remembrancer, who just totally saves the day at great cost to herself, tapping into the data spools inside her head that have all that information of Horus making the remembrancers watch the bombardment of the Loyalist Marines and gloating over it and just generally being an evil prick. And that is enough to convince Rogal Dorn, who takes them back to the Earth's moon, Luna, where they're all sort of in jail. Garrow has to convince Malkador the Sigillite, and Euphrati Keeler, who has exhibited her freaky saint powers, is being held onto by the Sisters of Silence. They're testing her basically just to see, is she a psyker, or what exactly is the source of her power? And that is where we end things. All right, summary out of the way. Now let's get into the meaty shit. First of all, Nathaniel Garro himself. Remember in the last book review, I said he is a poor man's Garviel Loken, and I absolutely stand by that. But the thing is, he kind of has to be, because of course, Garvey, as far as we know, at the end of the third book, is dead. He's trapped under rubble and gravely injured, and his Venthree is in the process of being bombarded to wipe out any remaining life after, the virus bombs. So we need another viewpoint character. Garrow literally is fulfilling the same function as Garviel Loken. He is a loyalist member of a traitor legion who is our viewpoint into what is going on behind the scenes, but also defects through a combination of just his own internal goodness and being willing to accept the evidence that is shown to him about the betrayal that's going on. That wouldn't be so bad. You need somebody to step in and fulfill this function. It would be very weird if the events of Flight of the Eisenstein were told from a traitor legionnaire or something along those lines, because of course the whole point of the book is escaping and getting home to the Imperium to warn everyone. My objection to Nathaniel Garro's character is that James Swallow was clearly like, okay, you've got this Garviel Loken guy, and everybody loves him. He's just such a starch-arse and wonderful and pure and wholesome and good. But my Garviel Loken is going to be better than that Garviel Loken. So I should also note, the character of Nathaniel Garro has existed since way before the Horus Heresy was anything more than some footnotes in the lore, way before it was a book series. Nathaniel Garro has always been kicking around in the lore as a loyalist escapee from a traitor legion. The context of his character wasn't fully fleshed out, but he's always been there. So I don't know why James Swallow is so fucking insecure that he has to make Garrow into just the biggest fucking Mary Sue out there. This is probably where I should explain. The Death Guard does not have typical companies like some of the other legions have. They have only 7 of what are called great companies. Remember, at the beginning of the first book, Garvey is the captain of the 10th company. Well, they only have the fucking 7 great companies in the Death Guard that are then broken down into sub-companies, apparently. Garrow is the battle captain of the 7th company and the rich Sui center of the character. So he is very old. He actually belonged to the Legion back when they were the Dusk Raiders. In the earliest days of, I guess what you would call the golden age of the Imperium, right as the Great Crusade was starting, the Emperor made all these legions for each of the Primarchs, but the Primarchs hadn't been rediscovered yet. So the legions are sent out part of an effort to, well, start conquering the galaxy in the name of the Imperium of Man, but also to find the Primarchs. And so the Death Guard, before they were the Death Guard, were known as the Dusk Raiders. And Nathaniel Garro is a Terran, which automatically makes you special in this world, because of course there's all these different planets all across the galaxy that people come from, but Terra is where the Emperor is from. Terra eventually becomes the holiest place in the Empire, so being a Terran is special. But also, not only did Garro fight as part of the Dusk Raiders, which would make him one of the oldest Marines, he fought alongside the Emperor himself and distinguished himself to the extent that it's the Emperor who gave him the rank of battle captain. Come the fuck on, okay? Like, it's a little bit much. He also has a very special sword named Libertas. I don't necessarily have a problem with any one of these details in isolation, but when you combine them all into one character, it's super Sue. He also has his own butler, basically the Alfred to his Batman. This does give us some interesting insight into how the Death Guard deals with failed aspirants. Most aspirants that don't make it to be Space Marines, I mean, most of them just die as part of the trials. The ones that survive but don't qualify, most of them just kill themselves. But for those who don't, apparently in the Death Guard back when it was the Dusk Raiders, if a Space Marine who had passed their trials wanted to, they can speak up for you and you become their personal servant. A huskarl, which is just an old English term for butler or house servant. A failed aspirant butler named Caleb, and of course all of the non-Terran Death Guard Marines think this is a stupid tradition and they all pick on Caleb constantly. Caleb is also part of the cult of the Divine Emperor, which becomes important later. We basically have like, what if Garviel Loken but on some kind of character steroids? Got a special sword, personally commended by the Emperor, which is also one of those like, so if you spent time in the Emperor's presence, wouldn't that maybe take some of the shine off of a Primarch? Once you've actually been gilded, as it were, by the Emperor being in your company, what else could possibly compare? But whatever. Much like with Garviel, some of the other captains in the Death Guard do not like him. They are jealous of him and the fact that he's always better than them. And Mortarion himself is constantly trying to woo Garrow over to his side in the conflict, but also just, he is a simp. Mortarion is a fucking simp for one of his own legionaries. After the big battle with the gross psychic Xenos, there's a scene where, since Garrow has distinguished himself so much, one of the traditions of the Death Guard, and they are not overly given to ornamentation or anything along those lines, but they have this thing called the Cups, which is Mortarion and his first captain, Callus Typhon, not like that's a bad guy name or anything, where they make up a cup of poison and they all drink and toast to death, or well, fending off death. And Mortarion basically has to beg Garrow to go along with it because Garrow is that level of starch arse. Also, Garrow does not like the warrior lodges, and part of why he ends up on the Eisenstein at all is because Mortarion just can't bear the thought, I guess, of getting rid of him, and is like, alright, this is one last chance maybe for Garrow to show that his loyalty to me outweighs his loyalty to the Emperor. Part of my problem with this is that the way the Primarchs of the various traitor legions go about trying to hold on to loyalists and try to recruit them and woo them to the cause makes no fucking sense. The traitor Primarchs have all been convinced that the Emperor wants to make himself into a god and he's gonna kill off the Primarchs and their legions as soon as they're no longer convenient for him to use. Horus had his vision, and then Fulgrim was basically convinced after Horus told him of the vision and showed him the Lectitio Divinitatis, which shows that there's a cult of the Emperor. Of course, the Emperor himself had no control over whether or not that cult was created in the first place, but Horus conveniently doesn't tell Fulgrim that. But Mortarion has a lot of conversations with Garrow. In some ways, these are the conversations that I wanted Horus to have with Garvey in the third book, and so I appreciate that. I like that that's in there. The problem is that Mortarion is just kind of dancing around the subject. He is clearly trying to make Garrow into his bestest friend, but he doesn't explain why. Tell them what you think is the truth. Tell them that you think, you genuinely believe that the Emperor is the bad guy here, and let them make that choice, as opposed to trying to sort of nudge them into it. I can maybe understand if this was one soldier among other soldiers who was just afraid that maybe if they reveal the truth, they'll be killed, but these are Primarchs we're talking about here. Nathaniel Garro, for all that he is a puissant warrior with his own special sword, is not the match of a Primarch. Mortarion has nothing to lose by just laying the evidence on him. This pussyfooting dance that they're doing, I'm like, come on guys, just say what's on your mind. Mortarion also goes so far out of his way to try and truly befriend Garrow that he brushes off his first captain, Callus Typhon, to take Garrow with him when they go to the Vengeful Spirit and they're discussing the plans for what they're gonna do on Istvan 3. Yeah, that's just how horny for Garrow Mortarion is. And yet he's not willing to actually, like, bring him into his confidence. So there's no reason that Garrow would be wooed in the first place. We already know just how upstanding he is, and Mortarion should know that too. This is a big issue that crops up in multiple books. I would say that's probably my one real complaint with this book, because otherwise I enjoyed it a lot. Alright, so now we're gonna get into the eye look. I don't have a white eyeshadow. The original, like, pre-Heresy Death Guard are white with green trim, but later on, when they are the pet legion of Nurgle, their armor and their whole look is supposed to be like rotting flesh. Delicious. So usually what it is kind of a flesh tone with a sickly green coating on it. It might actually be slime or entrails or whatever, with some feverish pink and red around the huge open gaping sores and some darker green pustules around the edges. So that's kind of what I'm gonna try and do with my eye look. We'll see how this goes. I've prepped my eyes with the MAC Paint Pot in Painterly, which is pretty close to the color of my skin. Next, we're gonna go in and stamp on some black. To make this appropriately dark. Let's talk a little bit more about Mortarion. So Mortarion is the only Primarch who I would say is remotely close to Perturabo in terms of being just a big old pissy bitch. He and the Emperor have never really gotten along. Well, I mean, the Emperor has gotten along just fine with Mortarion. It's Mortarion who has a problem with his dad. When his gestation tube was sent spiraling out from the secret base in the Himalayas out into the wilds of fucking space, it came to rest on a planet called Barbarous. And it's just as charming as it sounds. This is a planet that has a really weird atmosphere, which is kind of toxic and becomes more toxic the higher up you go. There's a lot of mountains and whatnot, and Mortarion was forcibly adopted by a demon. At least his name makes sense, right? So the demon gave him the name Mortarion, which means the child of death. In this one book, there's a really good reason for a character who started off good having an obvious bad guy name. Thank you, Games Workshop, for making a thing make sense. And Demon Dad and Mortarion obviously clash, but basically Demon Dad is like, ha ha ha, I'm more powerful than you and you can't do anything. So eventually when Mortarion is old enough to strike out on his own, he does, transforming the inhabitants of this shit world. He starts to give them some self-confidence, also to turn them into a functional army so they can fight off the demons that infest this place. Once he does that, he starts training himself to kill his asshole adopted dad. Well, that's exactly when the Emperor shows up and is like, son, I'm here to rescue you. And Mortarion's like, I have to kill my dad. I don't need your help. The problem is, of course, is that he's too high up in the mountains and the atmosphere is just, even for a Primarch, it's too much. Demon Dad is busily kicking his ass and might have killed him, but then the Emperor stepped in. On one hand, you can understand the Emperor probably doesn't want Mortarion to die. On the other hand, Mortarion never really forgives him for kill stealing. From that point on, things are strained, but Mortarion, like, the thing about him is clearly what he wants is love and validation and appreciation from his father. This is a thing we're gonna come back to. Pretty much all of the Primarchs have some kind of Freudian psychosexual daddy issues. Mortarion does not feel appreciated by his father. I think James Swallow illustrates this really well in the cups scene. Mortarion's like, I don't, lavish my soldiers with praise because they shouldn't need it, but at the same time, you have to reward people for the good things they do or they might resent you, which is just totally him projecting his concerns onto Garrow. I do think that it's a nice touch that shows that Mortarion hasn't always been a complete gross douchebag, because he clearly cares about his men, and he wants to spare them from the bad feelings that he's had about his father. Mortarion, though, big incel energy, the incelist of all of the Primarchs. For one thing, Barbaros's atmosphere, right, is super gross and not as oxygenated as regular human habitable planet. It's considered a death world. The Death Guard, one of their things is that they can survive conditions that very few other, even Space Marines or Primarchs, can tolerate. The Death Guard are hard to kill is a thing that is oftentimes said about them. So that's cool. But Mortarion, to show off this fact, has in his power armor some kind of gas system that allows the atmosphere from Barbaros, or I assume a gas mixture that approximates it, like he can just vent it whenever he wants to show off. It does not smell good. So Mortarion is literally mouth farting at everyone in his life so he can show off how tough he is. God. There's the fact that he's a huge simp for Garrow. I think it's anybody that reminds him of his dad he just instantly falls in love with and is like, will you be my friend, please? Desperation is not attractive, Mortarion. He also hates anything to do with psychics or psychic power in general. Now, he's not the only one of the Primarchs to have this attitude, but it also makes him a gigantic fucking hypocrite when he eventually not only turns traitor against his father, but gives himself to the forces of chaos. And they imbue him with all of this, oh yeah, warp-based psychic power. His first captain, Callus Typhon, is a psyker. Typhon is constantly having to suppress his powers, I guess. This is a big part of why Typhon probably hates Mortarion and has been secretly working at his downfall for years. You know, when you're actually good at something, but your boss hates that thing and they forbid you from doing it, I can only imagine the fucking resentment. Not that that excuses what Typhon does, but at least we understand some of his reasoning. Do I look gross yet? Mortarion isn't the worst Primarch in terms of dealing with his men, but he's far from the best. He does have a cool weapon though, so there's that. Now here's when shit's really gonna get wild. Mortarion, giant simp, giant hypocrite, and on one hand I kind of understand his reasoning for turning traitor. On the other hand, it's like, did you ever just sit down with your dad and ask him, for some affection? The Emperor definitely doesn't do the best job, Mortarion, but at the same point in time, this is not like what happens between the Emperor and Angron. Nowhere near that level of bullshit. It's starting to look a little bit dead, at least. And I mean, Mortarion is also totally cool with dropping virus bombs on his own men. As we learn, of course, in the third book, most of the Death Guard legionaries are caught outside when that hits. And Mortarion's just cool with that, so fuck him. He's goth, but he's not goth in a cool way. Not like Corvus Corax, for example. Mortarion is more like an emo kid, I would say. So that's Mortarion, who is our Primarch, and obviously his personal shit is going to become a lot more important as the heresy stretches on. We'll get to a lot more about him later. Okay, so that's the eyes. I'm pretty satisfied with that, actually. I kind of want it to be a little bit messy, right? If there's one thing Nurgle is, it is not neat and tidy. Now, before we get into scary warp shit, we have to talk about the awesomeness of Dreadnoughts. What? You may ask, did we not cover this in book 3? And the answer is no! No, I will never be done talking about Dreadnoughts and just their overall level of awesomeness. Oh, God. So there's a scene in this book. Let's talk about the pros, right? I think James Swallow is a better writer overall than either Graham McNeill or Ben Counter, just in terms of his command of the language alone. I think he's also better at writing emotional scenes that aren't aren't just combat scenes. I wouldn't say that he's as good as Abnett, but he's pretty good. There's a scene in this book that kind of made me cry, and I know I am not the only one who feels that way. We get some scenes from the battle down at Isfahan 3 from the perspective of the Death Guard. One of those scenes is a very touching moment, and very, very sad, between a captain of the Death Guard, so Ulis Temeter, one of Garrow's friends, and a loyalist. And of course, since this is from Ulis Temeter's point of view, we hear about just how happy he is that the Death Guard get to be the first ones down on the planet's surface. They're just gonna kick so much ass, it's gonna be so great, which, of course, when the betrayal comes, it is all that much more horrible. But when they find out about the virus bomb attacks, and then once the bombs start dropping, Ulis Temeter is just herding his men into sealed bunkers so that they won't die of the virus bomb. To jog everyone's memory, the virus bomb is a horrifying weapon. It's so bad that the Emperor and Horus are the only people that can really authorize its use in combat, and it just turns you to liquid within seconds, usually. For most regular humans, it's instantaneous. For Space Marines, it might take a minute, and probably not even a regular Primarch could survive that. We know the Demon Primarchs can, but that's because they're literal warp entities after their transformations. And that will become important in the future. Temeter, as the captain, is getting his men in, and he's outside with a dreadnought named Huron Fall. It's like, inside, inside, inside! But there is not enough time for Temeter to get in before he's got the virus in his body. And of course, the dreadnought Huron Fall was also trying to get Temeter inside, but it's too late. Temeter can feel his body starting to break down. While he's outside with Huron Fall, who you think is sealed up inside his dreadnought, normally the virus bombs can't do anything to a dreadnought that's fully sealed, Temeter sees that there's a crack in Huron Fall's sarcophagus casing. And he realizes that Huron Fall was also staying out to get people inside with the knowledge that this would cost him his very long life. And so, even through the pain, Temeter understood. There was a small fracture in the old warrior's ceramite casing, not enough to have slowed him on the battlefield, but more than the virus needed to reach inside the dreadnought's hull and savage the remnants of flesh inside. You lied. Veteran's prerogative, came the reply. We'll go together then, shall we? Huron Fall asked, embracing Temeter's body to him, moving swiftly away from the bunker. It took every last effort from Temeter to nod. Blinded now, he could feel the tissues of his eyes burning and shriveling in his head, the soft meat of his lips and tongue dissolving. Huron Fall's systems were on the verge of shutdown as he stumbled to a safe distance, skidding to a halt. This death, rasped the voter. This death is ours. We choose it. We deny you your victory. With a single burning nerve impulse, the mind of the warrior at the heart of the dreadnought uncoupled the governor controls on his compact fusion generator and let it overload. For a moment, there was a tiny star on the battered plains outside the Coral City, marking 2 more lives lost within a maelstrom of murder. My heart. James Swallow is capable of writing just really good shit, you know, and I'm like, I should not be getting misty-eyed at the thought of fucking Dreadnoughts, and yet, here I am. So, love you Rylanor, love you Huron Fall, there are more Dreadnoughts to love, don't worry, we'll be meeting more of them. I'm gonna try a bit of an experiment. Normally, I contour on my cheeks and my nose with a technique that's called underpainting, meaning I simply do it before I put my foundation on so that it's not really overwhelming, but I also have contour powder, and today we're gonna try and just hollow out my cheeks a little bit more to go with that whole illness thing. We'll see how it looks in the end. If it looks a little bit absurd, I mean, that's fine. This is a makeup look for the Death Guard. Let's really carve out those cheeks. Warp shit, yes. Are you ready for some Nurgle? Some motherfucking Nurgle! At this point in the story, obviously Mortarion has not yet fallen to chaos, and he will, and thus the Death Guard will become Nurgle's Legion of Chaos Marine. Nurgle, of course, is the warp entity god of plague and stagnation and rot. All the Chaos gods, since they embody natural forces, do have a sort of benevolent aspect to them. He's also the god of growth and rebirth. We just don't really get to see that side of him all that often. He's very gross, but he's also paradoxically happy about it. And if you surrender your will to him, you also will become extremely happy, even while your insides are rapidly becoming your outsides. Nurgle is generally depicted as being a fat, jolly kind of... Imagine Santa Claus, only with leprosy and covered in open weeping sores. Maybe don't picture that. Let's not. But Nurgle very much wants Mortarion and eventually gets him, much to Mortarion's chagrin. But that's a review for another book. When they are trapped in the warp with the forces of Nurgle, so Ignatius Grulgor and his undead traitors, would be a pretty good band name. The Plague Marines, I guess this is the first instance of what are called Plague Marines, so Nurgle's Chaos Marines, and they do not go gently. If they wound you, you're gonna contract some kind of horrible fucking illness. This is what happens to Decius, a younger Marine that Garrow is kind of taken under his wing. Decius is always spoiling for a fight, really aggressive, so everybody acknowledges that he's young, and kind of a doofus in terms of his willingness to just fight at the drop of a hat no matter what. He gets infected with Nurgle spores and spends most of the rest of the voyage as an invalid. The course of this fucking disease ravaging his body is legit just straight up disgusting, but also fascinating. The detail with which Nurgle infects people shows just a lot of care and attention to detail. He is a professional, and it shows. There's a lot of threes in this book. When the Death Guard eventually fall to chaos, their symbol becomes 3 skulls inside pointing arrows. The worms that are eating Decius's flesh from within all have 3 eyes. They're like mini Nurgles running around. It's kind of like fractal art. There's 3 eyes on the worms, and so if you zoom out, you can see threes and skulls and patterns in the gross, disgusting wounds and rents in people's flesh, but entirely in keeping with how Nurgle does business. So with blush, I decided I'm gonna just pack on a lot so I can look appropriately feverish. I mean, yes, I also love to just pack on blush because I'm a green-skinned olive person, and blush makes me look a little bit more human. Actually, I'm gonna go ahead and do it 80s style. There's a thing that's kind of the granddaddy of contouring, which is called draping, which is basically what I'm doing now, where you're taking your blush up the side of your face, like what you would do with a highlight. I am practically fervid. We're gonna put a little bit of that on the tip of my nose. Yeah, not just the eye look this time, friends. I guess my second complaint in the book is that they don't just kill Decius. At the end of the book, he finally falls in his soul to chaos. He's been fighting it and fighting it and fighting it, and Nurgle's voice is in his head like, I can make you happy. You know, just let go and let me take control and everything will be better for you. And he fights it and he fights it, but like literally worms are eating him and shit, right? I don't really fault him for giving in at the end, and I just kind of wonder, I think it would have been way more merciful to just put him down and could have avoided the whole him transforming into a chaos demon called the Lord of the Flies. Yeah, that's a thing that happens. So flies are everywhere and are totally gross, and Garrow temporarily dispatches him, but I'm pretty sure he comes back as the Lord of the Flies. I guess life after death. This is all a big foreshadowing of what is eventually going to happen to Mortarion and the rest of the Death Guard. Finally, I would like to talk about women. One of the big accusations that is always being lobbed at Warhammer is that there's no women in it and it's very hostile to women, and I would like to say that is not true. Not true at all. I also, shout out to all of my people on Reddit, on r/40k lore and r/grimdank. I love you. I love y'all. I do not find those places to be hostile to women, nor do I find these books to be. Any story about an army that is primarily made up of men, there's not going to be as many female characters. Like, I didn't expect there to be a ton of female characters in the Band of Brothers TV show either, but for the most part, the authors of the Black Library are making really good faith attempts to have more women in the story. So there's a lot of women in army positions, like through the Imperial Guard and the Imperial Navy. There's female Titan pilots. We're gonna get to some of the female bad guys, and oh man, are they great. There's a character called Sota Null who I'm so excited to talk about. Oh my god, she is incredible. In these first few books, of course, we have our Remembrancers and our Living Saint. So Euphrates Keeler is very important in this book. She appears in a vision to Garrow while he is in a coma after his horrible wounds on his Van Extremis. A vision of her and the Emperor's power, but also of needing rescue. This is the thing that finally makes Nathaniel Garro an interesting character. Thing that saves him from his sooness, at least kind of, and makes him less Garviel Loken. And that is, he believes in the Imperial cult. He, in this book, makes a complete turn to being one of the faithful. And I should point out, this is rare for Space Marines. It seems like even in 40k, when the Emperor is openly acknowledged as a god, that Space Marines don't really go in for that, no matter how much the regular people in the Imperium do. For a Space Marine to become a true believer, that's pretty exceptional, and I do think adds a really interesting dimension to his character. But I'm not supposed to be talking about men, I'm talking about women. So we've got Euphrates Keeler as the Saint, and she's doing Saint stuff full time now. She's not in a coma. She's completely accepted her abilities, and even though she doesn't always understand what she can do, she knows that she can use her will and her faith in the Emperor to cause miracles circles and save people. Watching her develop as a character and kind of grow into her powers, that's been great. We also have in this book the Sisters of Silence. They are psychic gnolls and they are a sisterhood. The upper ranked ones, they don't speak at all. They take a vow of silence. This is basically your final vows that you take when you become a nun, is the vow of silence. So the junior members are allowed to speak within limited contexts, which is how Amandara, one of the junior Sisters of Silence, talks to Garrow. They have some really cool moments of just, you know, talking about shit. They save each other's lives in battle. One of the neatest things about this book is we get to see not just women on the battlefield, but women and space marines are working together to help each other fight. It's really cool and, quite frankly, pretty damn progressive, because the idea of an all-female unit is one thing and an all-male unit, but actually having them fight together is one of the big bugaboos of modern thinking as regards men and women operating in combat. And the thing is, the Sisters of Silence, while their primary ability is their awesome psychic nullification, they are no slouches in combat either. And then you have Mercedes Oleton. Oh god, I love this character. I've loved her from the beginning. It is so cool to have a female character who isn't a warrior. She's a remembrancer. She's also an augmented human, so she's got this extended skull full of data spools, and she can record things. She can blink and capture still images, or she can capture live video footage effectively in her brain. This is what is used to finally convince Rogel Dorn that the Horus Heresy is real, that Horus has turned his back on the Emperor and his loyalist brothers. This is not easy on her either. Reviewing this footage is intensely traumatic, and she does it anyway. Black characters are not all that common in fiction. That's mostly written by and targeted at white guys. But also, she's a very complex character. She is super interesting, because on one hand, she's a skeptic. She's the one who fights the idea of the cult of the Divine Emperor the most, even though her friend, Euphrati Healer, is literally working miracles. Mercedes stays a skeptic for quite some time. She's also very delicate, like incredibly beautiful and waifish. Garvey thinks of her as frail, and her characterization is kept remarkably consistent across 4 different books that have 4 different authors. So she's an incredibly loyal friend. She's a very, very talented remembrancer. She's a skeptic. She's kind of a damsel in distress, and that's not a bad thing. This is a much bigger topic. I do not have adequate academic chops to really discuss this at length, but there's a whole thing in feminism, I guess, and feminist literature where for white women, the damsel in distress archetype is almost always a bad thing, because it's basically just you're there to be beautiful and lovable, but not a woman of action. There's been this struggle to get away from that. But black women in the United States, especially because of the horrifying history of slavery, culturally speaking, are seen as hardworking, and that's their primary value as people, which gross. So the idea of a black damsel, this does not happen in fiction all that often. If you boil down everything, it basically is a woman who is valuable just as herself. Like, valuable enough that big burly men are always coming to her rescue, and that's Mercedes Oleton. Big beefy space marines are always showing up to rescue her when she is in distress, because again, she's very petite. Also, she's so just graceful that even though she comes from a hive world, like comes from nothing basically, and worked her way up because of her talent, people by the 4th book start assuming that she is a highborn lady and start referring to, as opposed to Miss Oleton, the Lady Oleton. These books blow past the Bechdel test, which is great, so 2 female characters with names actually talking to each other about something other than a man, but also she does her job, and she does it incredibly well, literally saves a boatload of space marines, but also she doesn't have to be a warrior. She can still be this delicate, beautiful, frail kind of damsel in distress. I don't know if that was the goal of Dan Abnett when he created this character. I don't know how much he thought about that sort of stuff, but it's just cool that she exists, and also is kind of in an interracial relationship with Garvey. They're meant to be together. I really do enjoy the way women are depicted in these books. You get to see so many different types of female characters, and they're all important in their own ways. Not only can women mix it up with space marines, but they can also be frail and delicate and beautiful, but still worthwhile. I just think that's so cool. Now, to complete the look for lips. I was thinking, what exactly can I do with my lips? There's a thing where you put concealer all over your lips. It was big 5 years ago, and I have always hated it. I don't want to look like a lizard. I enjoy having lips. I'm a mammal. Also, that really only works on people whose lips are kind of the same color as their skin, and mine are pretty pigmented. But then I had an idea. I'm gonna use some lip liner and our sickly green eyeshadow. There we go. I kind of like it, actually, in order to look properly plague-ridden. So my overall thoughts on this book, obviously I enjoyed it. I liked it a lot. It's way better than either books 2 or 3. If I was gonna rank these first 4 books of the series, which again, these are all must-reads. If you're trying to get into the Horus Heresy, you absolutely do need to read all 4 of these books. So I would rank them in 1, Horus Rising, 2, Flight of the Eisenstein, 3, Galaxy in Flames, False Gods. This was a very, very enjoyable book. It covered a lot of ground. It's very rich. The prose is better than the previous 2 books. You get to learn a lot of really cool stuff. And so this is the final look. I'm actually pretty happy with how this turned out, because, you know, doing a makeup look based on the Death Guard that isn't, you know, special effects makeup might not have turned out so nice, but I'm actually liking it. Obviously, this isn't the most work-appropriate look, but I actually like it quite a bit. So that's my review. Next time, of course, we're getting into a very, very different kind of book. That would be Fulgrim, and oh man, there's so much to talk about that too. Do you see any flaws in my critique? Are you a huge Nathaniel Garro fan? Let me know about it down in the comments. And until next time, happy Nurgling, y'all!